Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Jessica Lorena Diaz and Karina Acosta from the Fe Justicia Workers Center. Fe Justicia will be the recipient of our shared offering for the next 3 Sundays. It's an organization that advocates for and builds power with workers who do not have formal union representation. Jessica is the center's manager and a graduate of the University of Houston Law Center. Karina is a legal assistant under the Community and Support Center. She's currently a third-year student at Thurgood Marshall Law School of Law. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We're a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Jessica and Karina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
So I thought we'd just start out with a really simple question of what is Fe Justicia and what kind of work do you do?
Okay, so Faith and Fe Justicia, or Faith and Justice Workers Center, we are divided into 3 departments, right? So the first one is the legal department, and then we have the safety and health department and the domestic workers department. So the legal department is what I do. I do wage theft claims, discrimination claims, and that sort of stuff. We also have unjust termination cases. And then we have the safety and health department. In that department, we deal with a lot of, like its name, a lot of health and a lot of safety issues. If the employer is not providing, especially right now with the pandemic, if they're not providing the social distancing, the mask requirements, and the glove requirements, then that's something that we take care of and making sure that they are taken care of. They mostly deal with a lot of labor workers in that department. And then we have the domestic workers department. That one deals with nannies and that sort of programs that will help them. Mm-hmm.
So what are the kind of supports and help that you offer workers in these sorts of situations?
So in these 3 different departments, we offer different support systems for each one of them. For example, in the legal department, we do offer free legal representation for these clients and also in guidance on how they can either put in a claim with the FJWC, with EEOC, with the DOL, or if they need to take on their case to a small claims court. We do help them in that transition, but we are also very aware that this is something that's not just on a legal basis, this is also an education basis. So we also take this opportunity to have them sit through a Know Your Rights presentation so this doesn't repeat itself again. In regards to the safety and health, we do deal with mainly day laborers, and as we know, these are migrant workers. Most of them have been in the United States for an average of 3 to 6 months whenever we reach out to them. So they're still relatively new as to what their rights are, and especially during this pandemic, what they need to ask from the employer as something as basic as a face mask. In order for them to perform their job, they're not aware that that is something that they are in their right to do, right? Because they're very intimidated by their status. And then lastly, with the domestic workers, we are in the process of organizing domestic workers because as we know, they are also considered essential workers. So they are nannies, janitors in particular, right? If they are housekeepers as well, if they are taking care of the elderly, these are categories that fall under an essential worker. But because most of them are undocumented, we see a lack of representation and a lack of organizing and advocating for this group of people. So that's something that we're currently in the midst of working with. Something as simple as like providing the average health insurance or health coverage, or just providing the average amount of sick days, right? That's not something that they have because they do fall under what's a category of like an independent contractor because of their status, because they have different employers throughout the week, unlike other regular 9-to-5 jobs.
I mean, I have a background in the labor movement, and I think one thing that I noticed that you just said was you talked about how they don't have both representation, but also domestic workers typically don't fall under like the National Labor Relations Act, right? In terms of like their kind of protections. And so for our viewers, the National Labor Relations Act allows most workers to enjoy a certain set of protections in forming unions and a set of, like you can seek a labor election, a federally supervised election to get a labor union established. So I'm particularly curious, how do you, so you're organizing these people, I'm sure, by these workers by using legal status, legal means through court actions and the various different agencies you just talked about. But what else are you doing to sort of organize them?
So currently what we are doing is we are trying to start meeting with elected officials, and we are trying to ask for them to support us in an average, in order for them to have just the basic needs, like I mentioned, like the like average sick days, right? Or having the right to have some sort of medical coverage, right? So currently what we're doing is we're trying to gather as many stories as we can. Through these months, starting in March, we did have several cases to where domestic workers, particularly caregivers of the elderly, did get they did get the virus through their client, and their client continued to demand that they show up. Not the client, but the client's family, right? That was taking care of the elderly. So we wanted to start gathering up those stories and gathering up signatures and support. So one of our next steps right now is to kind of see really what the numbers are within these domestic workers that were either came out COVID-19 positive or were working around other people that were COVID-19 positive. And we're trying to take these stories to City Council. That's our first step that we're working on right now, and essentially working our way up to Texas Ledge that's coming up this next year, and doing kind of like a press conference or turning in signatures with our local elected officials here in Texas, so they can start seeing that this is also an issue that needs to be covered. And when we speak about essential workers, we also need to cover the domestic worker part as well, that a lot of people kind of try and do like a blind eye on. That's really what we have been working on right now. It's relatively still green. We find that we have a lot of struggle organizing our people because of legal status. A lot of them have that fear that if they were to come out, not only will they lose their jobs, right, or somebody will like report them to ICE. So we're in the process of, we have to make sure that we call them one-on-one and we have a conversation with them and make sure it's something that they're comfortable with. And if they're not, we don't pressure them to doing something they don't want to do.
That is totally understandable. I mean, it's got to be very difficult. Well, I know it's very difficult working or organizing undocumented workers because of what you're talking about. And I know that ICE is a sort of constant threat in people's lives and is often weaponized by employers to sort of keep workers docile. And has even been used, I think, in some cases when workers start to organize to come in and bust up unions in a way. So, yeah. So, I know you're sort of talking about doing this organizing in the context of the pandemic. And so I kind of have two questions. One, about that. One is, how has the working conditions for people changed during this pandemic, both the domestic workers and the day laborers that you all work with?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So a lot of the changes that I've seen, and you have to remember, the audience that we serve, most of them, sometimes they're not able to read, they're not able to write. Mm-hmm. So we have to be there one-on-one. We're not like a law firm where we could do everything on Zoom. Like, no, we have to have that one-on-one with our clients. Mm-hmm. So we have to still practice social distancing. We still have to wear the mask. We still have to serve them. And so I feel like that's the unique thing about Justicia. So we've been able to still serve our community, but we've had to follow the orders of social distancing and masks and stuff like that. Now with day workers, we still serve them, but we have to, again, still follow the protocols. Social distancing, the masks, the gloves, and that such. So yeah, it definitely has changed in the way that we help our community, but we're still doing it, and we're still going to continue to do it.
One of the biggest shifts that we saw, specifically when the pandemic started, was that after that first month, we saw, like, at the beginning of April, once everything was already shut down, we were in complete shutdown. On the first week of April, we saw our phone calls decline. And we didn't understand why we were no longer getting reports or even calls of people asking for help. But then we realized it was because bills were starting to be due, and a lot of them were getting their phones cut off. So we saw our calls kind of decline and our WhatsApp calls incline. And that is because you don't need service. You just need Wi-Fi to be able to communicate through this app, right? So like Karina said, a lot of the ways that we had to adjust were a little bit kind of informal, so to speak, because our members don't know how to read, don't know how to write. A lot of them also don't have the knowledge of technology yet, so we can't just say, click on this Zoom link and I'll speak to you, because they have no idea what that is, right? So we had to do a lot of social distancing in person one-on-ones, and they have been really, really respectful about that. Even whenever we go out to the day laborer corners, wherever they gather, they're very respectful in waiting for us to set up cones that are 6 feet apart. And whenever we ask them to make a line, they're very respectful in standing by those cones, and they don't approach us unless we give them the okay to do so. So they're kind of aware of kind of what is going on as a whole, but the way that we've had to come about it has been very, very different than other organizations.
Well, that's, I mean, it sounds like you've really put a lot of thought into how to make this work safely for people. Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody's had to adjust in so many different ways to this pandemic, and I think it's really commendable that you figured out how to adjust to figure out how to continue to support and advocate for some of the most marginalized workers in the country. So I'd like to talk a bit about the workers themselves and like their working conditions. And I don't know if you have any like particular stories or examples of like workers that you've worked with that have had like, you know, their situations changed dramatically because of the pandemic, either people losing work or their own health and safety situations becoming a lot worse, or just, you know, whatever. But I think that any stories you have to share would be very educational for people.
Well, we get stories on a daily basis, but I think one of the biggest stories that we got that we were really kind of shocked, right? I mean, you hear these things and you know it's happening, but whenever we get a call directly from a person that's being affected by this, it's a little bit different. One call that we got was from a construction company, actually, and they did marble top for their cabinets, like marble top cabinet. I'm not very familiarized with them. So what the employer was doing was, for example, let's say there is 10 employees, right? And out of those 10 employees, 5 of those employees are COVID positive. 3 of them are showing signs and 2 of them are not showing signs. So what he did was fire the ones that were showing signs, and then the ones that were not, he would ask them to continue to work, right? Continue to come into work. So what was going on was then that there was 3 empty spots now from those 3 people that he fired. So he would hire 3 other people, 3 new people, and he wouldn't tell them that there is COVID positive employees. Oof. And so it started building and building and building and building to the point where every employee was infected, and he still wasn't telling the new ones that he was hiring, and it kept going and going and going. And again, we saw that there was a large number of calls that they were kind of dealing with the same thing, but they were still showing up to work because they needed that job, right? Because once again, when it comes back to status, it's kind of hard to find another job. You can't just say, I'm going to go work at Target part-time, right, until I figure something out. That's not the way that it works whenever you have no legal status. You kind of really have to think about what's going to be my next step, right? So that was a really, really big scenario that we saw. And then not only did we see it with that construction company, we started seeing it with some popular label companies that are served around here in Houston. There was like a major chip company that was a distributor here in Houston that was doing the same thing, right? And that was kind of like, it brought a lot of sadness, I guess, to us, because we could just say, you know what, leave right now, come to my office right now and let's figure this out, because that's not the financial situation that they're in. We had another client that was a domestic worker, that was a janitor for a building, right? And there was COVID positive people also in that building. She was still forced to come in. She was a victim of sexual assault from her employer, but she was still staying in those conditions because she had to work. Essentially, the employer fired her because of her being uncompliant with the sexual abuse. And so as we were in the midst of processing her case and guiding her to what are the next steps that she had to take, about 2 weeks later, she called us and asked us to drop the case because she was going to have to go back and work with this employer because she couldn't find work anywhere else, and bills were coming up, and and her children. And so we understand that, but that's not the first time that stuff like that has happened. It happens so much. We have so many clients that come in with a very, very terrible abuse, right? Specifically safety and health abuse right now. And they go back, they come and they ask us to drop their case because they can't find work anywhere else, right? And that's happened so much. And with this particular client, we empathize a lot because as women, right, we know kind of how uncomfortable that makes us, how dreading it makes it to wake up in the mornings and go to work, right? When you know you're going to be exposed to this kind of behavior. And not only that, you might come back with COVID. You might end up COVID positive in a week or two. But there was nothing that we could say like, here, this place is hiring, because she was lacking that Social Security. She was lacking that status. So we kind of just are keeping an eye on her to see if she's okay, how she's holding up. And of course, the employer went back to doing the same toxic behavior, right? And she's just kind of dealing with it because she needs that paycheck.
So it sounds like in this environment, vulnerable workers are significantly more vulnerable than they were even 7 or 8 months ago. And I mean, it does sound like you're trying to draw the attention to elected officials to these sorts of situations. But that because people are so vulnerable, it's really hard to actually do anything.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that question of vulnerability does actually sort of move into another question, which is just sort of about the larger labor movement in Houston and kind of like who workers can turn to or how workers can organize here. Because I'm from up north, and I've definitely noticed that, like, and this was not like any secret when I moved here, but I've noticed that, like, you know, the labor movement here is way smaller than it is in like any major city that I've lived in. So I'm curious, as you know, working at one of them, or I guess the major workers center in Houston, kind of what your reflections are about the state of the labor movement here, and like what possibilities there are to further workers' power in the region.
Yeah, so I feel like the labor, and you're right, the labor movement here is very little.
Yeah.
You know, even though we're at the forefront and we're trying to push it to be bigger, there are a couple of, I guess you could say, walls that are built up for our audience. One of the biggest things that we see is, for example, most of our clients, they are undocumented. And so then if they have an accident or something of that sort, they are afraid to go to the hospital because how are they going to be treated? They have no status, sometimes no documentation. So I know there's a program with Harris Health in which they help our kinds of audiences. But then even in that program, sometimes they create barriers like documentations, proper documents that sometimes our clients don't have. Most of our undocumented clients don't have a driver's license, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they cannot get it here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that's something that they have to ask for that they don't have. So as much as they would want to get that documentation, the help of the Harris Health, and as much as Harris County wants to help that audience, it's kind of impossible. They have barriers for that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also to be kind of very transparent, Houston in general is a very welcoming city in a very unwelcoming state, for a lack of better terms. So Texas in general is one of two states, and it's Texas and Hawaii, that is an at-will state, which means that the labor laws in general, are put together to protect the employer, not the employee. So we have had cases where we have advocated, we have done the research, we have done the organizing, and then the case is won, right? Like a particular wage theft case. And what we see as a result against the employer is basically just kind of like a slap in the hand. And just kind of like, don't do that again and move on. So that's very discouraging, right? We may have won several wage theft cases, but in order to actually get the employer to pay up, there's no laws that are supporting that phase, wow. Right? There's nothing that I can legally tell you is the next step that we can take in order to ensure that the employer is going to pay up. That in itself is a whole other issue, right? Mm-hmm. And also it's a very, very lengthy process. It's a lengthy process. We are talking about a year of waiting in order for us to be able to even stand in front of a judge or in a small claims court, right? It's very, very, they just, like Karina said, they put a lot of walls up, and it's very hard to keep our audience like motivated whenever we are constantly we have setbacks like these. And so at the end of the day, it's not that we don't get results. It's just that there's so many laws that we have to work on, right? In order to be able to even see like a spark of sunshine at the end of the tunnel. So it's been very, very difficult. The longest case that we have now that it's still ongoing is almost going on 3 years. And we have already gotten judgment from the judge. We won the case, and the employer still hasn't paid up. And there's nothing that we can legally do yet to force them. Like, we can't freeze their accounts and go into their accounts and take the money out that we need to, right? There's no law that supports us for those following steps. So we're still kind of just begging and organizing and trying to do protests outside of the employer's house if we have to, in order to force them to pay up. But legally, there's nothing that we can do.
So do you do, you just mentioned protests outside of the employer's house, because you started out by talking about sort of your legal strategies, but I'd be interested hearing a little bit more about your sort of like direct action or protest strategies. So like in a case where somebody isn't paying up back wages, you're going to organize protests.
Yes.
And what other kind of things you're going to do, and how effective is that?
So we have to pick strategically which ones are the employers that would fall under pressure. To be completely transparent with you, we had a particular employer, and this was right prior to the pandemic, who picked up a day laborer and asked them to fix a roof. So the employer fixed the roof, told him, I think the total was about $2,000, $3,000, because he bought the material, he did the labor. And so the employer was actually a priest. And what the employer did was that he invited him over to church on Sunday, and then in front of the church thanked him for his volunteer work.
Oof.
And so everybody was super thankful to this guy, and this guy was like, no, I love you guys, but I really need to get paid. We never agreed that this was on a volunteer basis. And you can see that the employer used his audience to kind of go against him. So this was something that we were like, okay, we can easily go and protest on a Sunday and ask the man for him to pay. And since he's a person in leadership, he would fall under that pressure, right? So that's exactly what we did. We stood up there, we protested in front of the church, and we were like, you know what? If you are a man of God, you know deep down in your heart what you're doing is not right. What you did is not right, and this is your opportunity to fix it. Not only for your employee, but for your congregation to follow in those footsteps, right? And so he did. He ended up paying up because he fell under that pressure. So a lot of the times we usually have to do a little bit of stalking, and Karina and I have become really good at that, unfortunately, in like making sure we figure out like who is this employer, how much impact does he have in the community, he or she have in the community, what other assets do they have, what's something that we can go in and attack on. And a lot of the time when we come to organizing to like social demonstrations, right? Protesting helps standing in front of the employer's business, the church, standing in front of their home, it helps, right? It's just a matter of like figuring out what the employer is. And then, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's also a lot of employers who they kind of just disappear out of the face of the earth. We don't know who they are, especially here in Houston. There's so many contractors, quote unquote, that have their business, but they're never registered with the IRS. Therefore, it makes it completely impossible for Karina and I to be able to look for them and figure out who they are, because the business in itself, I can just say one day I'm going to wake up and say Jessica's landscaping or Jessica's construction business and make a couple of magnets, stick them in my car and call it a business. But in reality, I never paid taxes. It's never something that I registered. And so at the end of the day, it's really hard to track me. So it kind of balances itself out, but usually we get a lot of help from like social media or some of the programs that we use in order to run background checks on these people to see where they are, who they are.
So we're sort of nearing the end of this, and I think that the question I'd like to really kind of close on is sort of this question of how can congregations like First Church be an effective ally to Justicia, and like how can we collectively work to further workers' power in the Texas region? Well, in the state of Texas, but in the Houston region. Sorry.
No, I could definitely pitch in on that answer. So I've noticed with our communities that whenever they migrate to the United States, the first thing that they look for is a church. Yeah. They're very faith-based. And so I feel like communities like First Church, things that you guys could definitely do is just directly addressing the issue. Don't go over it directly. Address it. For example, I don't know if in your congregation, maybe you have, or you know that there's a percentage of undocumented communities inside your church. So providing programs like English classes or even workshops to help them apply to like I was mentioning, the Harris Health. Things like that could definitely help them, but just providing a space for them to not feel attacked, that would be very amazing for our communities. Really.
I think even simply just doing like a basic know your rights, or just recognizing that those people are in your communities, are in your churches, is really, really good. Us in general, as a whole, our organization is a faith-based organization. So we get to work a lot with churches, and we kind of just sit down usually with the church lead and say, you know what, let's be transparent about this. There's probably members of your church that are undocumented, or someone close to them is undocumented. So it wouldn't hurt to set up a 2-hour workshop or an hour workshop during the week or on a weekend, just to do a basic know your rights, right? And so a lot of them know that there is these undocumented members are in their churches. It's just a matter of like, how are we going to reach out to them to create that church a safe space? And Karina is right. Most of our newcomers, the first thing that they look for is a church. Whenever we get newcomers here at the Worker Center, they ask us, where is there a church here or a church there or a particular denomination that they believe in, right? Because they're looking for that community of support. So I think that it would be great if not only the members of the church became informed of these issues, but that they also created a space for them to be able to know their basic rights. Yeah.
That is very good to know. I know that actually we had a conversation with you all about doing a Know Your Rights workshop in September, but we're not meeting in person, so I guess that's
also been really bigger.
Yeah.
That's like, an interesting question. I mean, I'm like, you're saying that, and I know we had talked about doing something like that this fall, and now I'm like, well, how does one go about doing something like that in this this environment? Because but unfortunately, we may just have to leave that question there and follow up at some other point on it. So for our viewers, if you found this video, well, thank you actually both, first of all, for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that everybody who saw this video enjoyed it too. It was very informative. And for our viewers, if you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. This week we'll be holding our annual In-Gathering Water celebration. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Vizcarra assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as possible for us to gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.